I was reminded this week by someone in this podcast exactly where I was and how I was feeling precisely 2006, early August, being warm and sultry. I might have this wrong. And there was excitement in the air in Scottish football, especially in Glasgow. Paul Le Guen was coming to Rangers. Paul Le Guen, at the time one of the most exciting emerging European coaches, was coming to Ibrox. What would be the fate of this mercurial Frenchman? You might recall the state of Rangers back then. Alex McLeish's reign had gone from brilliant, 5 successive trophies on the bounce against Martin O'Neill's Celtic, to pretty ordinary, pretty bleak. The righteous Rangers fan base wanted McLeish gone, and there was pressure on David Murray, the Rangers chairman, to pull another rabbit out of the hat, to bring in someone big with the clout of a Dick Advocat, a heavyweight. Now, please note, before everyone jumps in, this was 2006. This was before the whole crash and burn EBT scandal engulfed and eviscerated Rangers. Oh, for sure, the EBTs were happening then. They were operative. But that summer of 2006 was long before the whole thing went up in flames. So just hold that there. Le Guen, we were told, I believed, was quite a capture by Rangers. He had just won 3 successive League One titles in France with Olympique Lyon and was receiving job offers from all over Europe. When Le Guen made it plain that he was leaving Lyon in the summer of 2005, everyone in football weighed in. He turned down jobs in Portugal, in Italy. I think Lazio even had a press conference arranged, ready to unveil him. He turned down jobs in Russia and elsewhere. Everyone wanted Paul Le Guen, it seemed, but he didn't seem to want them. The next Arsene Wenger, one of the French newspapers famously christened him, and he had the stats. He had the CV. But Le Guen was the original enigma. After his stunning success at Lyon, what did he choose to do next? Oh, he took a year out of football management to become a TV analyst with Canal Plus. And so all the Le Guen hunters had to be put on hold. He was going nowhere. Instead, as you downed your pizzas and your beer on the Champs-Élysées or in the Jura or down in the Loire or over on that rocky Brittany coastline, Le Guen's home patch, wherever you were in France, there he was on your TV screens, the new Alan Shearer of French TV. And this sabbatical actually played into Rangers' hands. By the mid-season of 2005-2006, it was obvious that Alex McLeish's reign would be coming to an end and that Rangers needed a real reboot, a very strong restart with a new coach of renown and substance. And I know exactly what happened because David Murray, we were talking back then, he gave me chapter and verse on chasing Le Guen, getting him, and then watching the whole thing evolve into a disaster. In February of 2006, with the Scottish newspapers starting to get hot on the subject of who the next Rangers manager might be, Murray flew in his private jet to Brittany to have a hush-hush meeting with Le Guen, well away from prying Scottish eyes. What I remember about this cloak and dagger trip was the odd sight of Murray, with his very obvious physical disabilities, for some reason being carted from his small plane on the French landing strip into the airport terminal on the back of some sort of baggage truck, standing upright and holding on four square to a railing on the back of this truck. Can you imagine it? By Christ, Murray later told me he was thinking, this trip better be worth it. Well, he met Le Guen, the man many a European football club had chased, and a few weeks later it was announced that the Frenchman would become the next manager of Rangers on June the 1st, 2006. What a coup this was for Rangers and for Scottish football, we thought. Look at what Le Guen had won and achieved in France. Little wonder the job offers had poured in for him. Except, in my case, I was given a sudden inkling by Celtic that this move might not be all that it was cracked up to be. I'll never forget a conversation I had back then with Peter Lawwell, not long in the door as the new Celtic CEO, who had a vivid story to tell me, and as it turned out, a prophetic one, about Le Guen. This conversation I had with Peter was off the record back then, but I don't suppose that matters now. It was 20 years ago. It's a harmless story of no great consequence. It hurts no one, but it was revealing. So Lawwell told me how anxious Celtic had felt about Rangers landing Le Guen. Lawwell had believed this was the real deal, a top European coach, maybe indeed the next Arsene Wenger. Peter explained to me how this was discussed at Celtic boardroom level and how Celtic would have to stiffen their resolve to face this new challenge at Rangers under Le Guen. But he said this anxiety was suddenly somehow allayed by a letter he received from a Celtic supporter who lived and worked in Lyon and who had closely watched Le Guen and Lyon's success. And this Celtic supporter told Peter Lawwell, quote, "You've got nothing to worry about. I don't think Le Guen and Rangers will work. It's the wrong model." Continue quoting. At Lyon, Le Guen was the head coach. He signed no one. He had nothing to do with that. He was merely given the players to work with. He had nothing to do with transfer market activity at all. End quote. This private information was interesting to me on 3 counts. First, it was true that it was a guy called Bernard Lacombe, that great French striker of the 1970s. Some of you might remember him, strong and dashing, who had been given the role of director of football at Lyon by the club's chairman, Jean-Michel Aulas, and who was credited with so much of Lyon's success during that Le Guen period, 3 league titles. Significant, secondly, because as it transpired, Le Guen at Rangers took on the role of signing players. Rangers back then had next to no scouting department, or at least nothing compared to how it should be today. And Le Guen made such a mess of buying players. I give you an untried Swedish centre-back named Carl Svensson. Remember him? And thirdly, significant because, as Peter Lawwell told me, this message he received from France suddenly made Celtic look at Le Guen differently. The whole Scottish press were excited and upbeat about Le Guen, and I was right in there myself. But Peter Lawwell told me that Celtic began to think, okay, let's see how this unfolds. And it did unfold, or rather, unravel. Le Guen brought the so-called Brittany bunch with him to Glasgow. That included his number 2, Yves Kalou. Le Guen originally was number 2 to him in French club football. And a physio called Joël Lehir, he was the guy that would end up being fined by Scottish police and banned from driving for a year for driving the wrong way around George Square, pissed at midnight with no car headlights on. This was how it was, but the Le Guen unravelling at Rangers, a bit like a lovely baguette, was a while in the making. What a fiasco Le Guen's Rangers signing policy became. There was a fire sale going on at Austria Vienna. I know because I went out there to see for myself. And they had this Slovakian striker, Filip Sibo, a guy carrying at least 2 stone above his fighting body weight, who had had a fine season with Vienna, but whom the club now wanted to offload. Note what I've just said. They wanted to offload. They had a fire sale. They needed to get money in. But I'll always remember a guy called Markus Kreismar, then the Austria Vienna chief exec, explaining to me how Rangers came on the phone looking to buy Sibo. Le Guen had got in cahoots with this football agent based in Austria, and he was shoveling Rangers all these players from the Austrian league. Libor Sionko was another. But for some unknown reason, with Austria Vienna perfectly happy to offload Sibo, they wanted him away. Rangers kept putting their own purchasing price up and up and up until finally, I think, they bought Sibo for something like €900,000. And Markus Kreismar said to me, it wasn't us at Austria Vienna that kept putting the fee up for Sibo. Rangers, whenever we expressed a small doubt, kept offering us more and more. Well, Austria Vienna got their fat cheque for their fat striker and could not have been more delighted. But something was already going wrong at Rangers. It's odd looking back at all these key Le Guen signings at Rangers that summer. Sibo, Sionko, Carl Svensson, Lee Martin, Jeremy Clement and more. So many of their careers petered out thereafter. You hardly heard a thing about what became of these players later in their careers. Just as an aside, I covered the World Cup finals in Germany that summer. What a brilliant trip. I based myself in Nuremberg, which was absolutely fascinating. And I went to cover Germany v Sweden, and I hung about afterwards to intercept Carl Svensson, then an 18-year-old reserve Swedish centre back who had been the last player to make it onto the Sweden World Cup roster of 22 players. Not a bad achievement in itself. I knew he was coming to Rangers, and so I interviewed the player and I wrote the piece up for the Herald. But a Swedish journalist whispered to me that day, Carl Svensson is never ready for Rangers. Never. You probably remember what happened next. The Rangers story under Le Guen collapsed. Setback upon setback in the league meant that they began losing ground to Celtic, so much so that David Murray, in late October of that 2006-07 season, had to summon the press up to Murray Park and explain to us, rightly I think, and I still think rightly, that he was prepared to go the extra mile for Le Guen, that he wanted to give this foreign coach a fighting chance to get it right in Glasgow. And I thought, and I still think, that Murray played fair and was justified in that stance. I liked Le Guen a lot, and I really wanted him to succeed. He was interesting on all sorts of fronts. Culturally, and I'm going to try and say this carefully, Le Guen was not of the new social media age or even the age of American TV channels invading France, whereby French people began to speak English in an Americanized accent. On the contrary, a bit like Claude Puel, Le Guen predated that. He was born in 1964 and still had that old-fashioned, indigenous, slightly allo way of speaking in English. Hence, he endearingly referred to Rangers as Rangers, and he famously said before the opening Old Firm game of the season, when we had severe doubts about his new team, Le Guen said, "The truth will be on the pitch." No harm in pointing any of this out. He was very likable and very intense, and I, a Francophile, I loved his Frenchness. But he was right. The truth was spoken on the pitch. So we came to New Year and a Motherwell v Rangers game at Fir Park, a day I remember because a Rangers fan outside the ground that day started shouting at me in this very distinctive, gravelly voice, "Bigot! Bigot!" And the game was up. I can't remember how many points Rangers were lagging Celtic, 12, 14, 16, I can't remember, but Le Guen resigned. And David Murray told me later he was very honourable. Contrary to a garish Sun backpage story, Murray said he never asked for a penny in compensation. And Murray added, Paul could have asked me to pay up the remainder of his 3-year contract of money out of Rangers, but instead he said, just pay for my removal van back to France. I went to France for 4 months to write a book about Paul Le Guen. I'm sure you can still find it somewhere on Amazon for 99p. There was myth right at the start and right at the end. Myth about this fine French former international footballer and manager. So Le Guen came from this small village in Brittany called Pancron, tiny little place, and he became known as La Patate de Pancron in French football. It was a newspaper headline that gave birth to the name. Le Patate de Pancron. What did this mean? Did it mean literally the potato of Pancron? No, it did not, but it gave birth to a hilarious and much repeated myth about Paul Le Guen. I'm no French scholar or speaker, but in French, la patate, une patate, was like a blow, a boxer's punch, or like a blast, une patate. And Le Guen, the footballer, had been known for his cannonball shot from outside the box, hence La Patate de Pancron. It made audio sense. It felt alliterative. I always remember dying with laughter when Nick Harris, a truly brilliant sports journalist, Nick's great, who at the time was covering Scottish football for The Independent, but when Nick wrote in the Indie of Le Guen, Paul Le Guen, Le Patate de Pancron, so called because his home village is famous for its spuds. Well, there isn't a tatty field within 30 miles of Pancron, but it became this delicious ludicrous myth about Paul Le Guen. Le Guen's mum was lovely to me. She was the Pancron village mayoress, and she dug out family photographs of Paul as a small boy on his bike and gave them for me to use in my forthcoming book. To my utter shame, and this won't surprise any of my friends, I forgot to post these photographs back to Madame Le Guen. And then, about 8 years later, when I discovered I was going on a family summer holiday to Brittany, I thought, great, this is my chance to return the photos. I'll take them with me. I didn't realise how huge an area Brittany was. We were about 70 miles from Pancron, famous for its spuds. Even more shamefully, I still have these photographs. Paul Le Guen had a translator while he was in Glasgow with Rangers, a guy called Jean-Jacques Chapelain, who hailed from Douarnenez down there on the Land's End of Brittany, down in that rocky western sea face. I went down to Douarnenez to see Jean-Jacques, and he told me how tough it had been for Le Guen at Rangers and how so intense was he while trying to get his English right and be able to communicate with his players that his shirt would quite often be wringing wet with sweat in the dressing room, nervous to do the job correctly. On all sorts of fronts, Le Guen and Rangers just didn't work out. Le Guen went as a coach to Paris Saint-Germain after Rangers, a further unfruitful time, and then to manage Cameroon and then Oman before coming home to Europe, most recently, I think, to manage Le Havre. I hate to say this because I really liked and admired the guy, but his coaching career fizzled out. So much for the old line about Le Guen doing 3 years at Rangers and then his credentials gleaming, taking English football by storm. It wasn't to be. La Patate de Pancron lost its fizz and petered out. I'll never forget being in a central Paris hotel foyer with Paul Le Guen when, out of nowhere, Martina Navratilova suddenly walked in the door. Le Guen exclaimed to me, "There's Martina Navratilova over there." Meanwhile, everyone else in that hotel foyer was saying, "There's Paul Le Guen over there." The trappings of sport, its fame, its successes and its failures. Who can explain them? Thanks for listening.